August 1950. The Naktong River, Korea. The Pusan Perimeter. Major General William Dean stood somewhere in the chaos of the retreating American forces and understood, in the specific way that combat commanders understand things when their forces are being systematically destroyed, that the United States Army in Korea was on the verge of a defeat that would end the war before it had properly begun. Dean would be captured by North Korean forces within days, becoming the highest-ranking American prisoner of war of the Korean conflict and spending the next 3 years in North Korean captivity. His capture was a small individual tragedy within a larger strategic crisis that, by August 1950, had compressed the entire American and South Korean military effort into a rectangular perimeter approximately 100 miles long and 50 miles wide in the extreme southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, anchored on the port city of Pusan. The North Korean People's Army had invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, with a force and a speed that had overwhelmed the South Korean military, which had been equipped and organized for internal security rather than for resisting a full-scale conventional invasion. The American forces that had been rushed from occupation duty in Japan to reinforce the collapsing South Korean defense, Task Force Smith and the units that followed it, had been thrown into combat with equipment that was inadequate against North Korean T-34 tanks and with a level of training and readiness that reflected the specific institutional atrophy that had characterized the American occupation army in the 5 years since the Second World War's end. The result, by early August 1950, was a retreat of approximately 150 miles in 6 weeks, the entire Korean peninsula south of the 38th parallel except for the southeastern corner anchored on Pusan, where the surviving American and South Korean forces had concentrated to make what military planners understood might be their final stand. The Pusan perimeter was bounded on the north and west by the Naktong River, which provided a natural defensive line, and on the south and east by the Korea Strait, which meant that the defenders had nowhere left to retreat. The perimeter contained the only port in South Korea still under United Nations control, and through that port the supplies and reinforcements that would determine the perimeter's survival were flowing. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army, had been given the specific mission of holding the perimeter regardless of cost, because the alternative to holding it was the complete loss of South Korea before American mobilization could produce the forces that the eventual counteroffensive would require. Walker's order to his commanders, delivered in the specific blunt language that the crisis demanded, became known as the Stand or Die order. There will be no more retreating, Walker told his commanders. We must fight until the end. Capture by these people is worse than death itself. We will fight as a team. If some of us must die, we will die fighting together. I want everybody to understand that we are going to hold this line. We are going to win. The North Korean strategy for breaking the Pusan perimeter was to attack along multiple axes simultaneously, attempting to find and exploit weaknesses in a defensive line that American and South Korean forces, fighting at the end of supply lines that had been stretched and compressed by 6 weeks of retreat, was stretched thin to defend. The Naktong Bulge, where the river curved in a way that created a salient that North Korean forces could potentially use to flank the American defensive positions, was the location of some of the most intense fighting of the entire perimeter battle. The 24th Infantry Division, the same division that had absorbed the initial shock of the North Korean invasion at Task Force Smith and had been bled white in a retreat to Pusan, held positions along the Naktong in conditions that the Korean summer made specifically brutal, temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees, water sources contaminated by the fighting and by the displaced civilian population, and an enemy that attacked at night with the specific tactics that had been overwhelming. American positions throughout the campaign's first phase. Private First Class Melvin Brown, who fought in the Naktong Bulge in August 1950, described the fighting in terms that captured the specific desperation of the perimeter defense. We knew there was nowhere to go, Brown said. Everybody knew it. Behind us was the sea. If the line broke, that was the end of it. There was no fallback position, no next defensive line, nothing. You held because holding was literally the only option that existed. That changes how you fight. You don't fight to win in the conventional sense. You fight because the alternative is not fighting, and not fighting means everyone behind you, every South Korean civilian, every American soldier who hasn't gotten here yet, all of it is gone. The North Korean attacks across the Naktong in August and September 1950 were repulsed repeatedly through a combination of American firepower, the specific tactical skill that the surviving American units had developed through the brutal education of 6 weeks of combat, and the air power that the United States Air Force and Navy could bring to bear against North Korean forces operating in the open terrain south of the river. The B-29 strikes that supported the perimeter defense, originally designed for strategic bombing against industrial targets, were redirected to tactical support of the ground forces, dropping bomb loads on North Korean concentrations that the close air support aircraft could not adequately address given the scale of the North Korean assault. The naval gunfire from American warships positioned off the Korean coast provided support to the eastern portion of the perimeter, the specific advantage of naval mobility allowing fire support to be concentrated wherever the North Korean pressure was most severe. The 1st Marine Provisional Brigade, the 1st Marine Ground Combat Unit committed to Korea, arrived at the perimeter in early August 1950 and was used as a mobile reserve, committed to whatever sector of the perimeter was experiencing the most severe pressure, a tactical role that required the Marines to fight at Obong-ni Ridge in the Naktong Bulge, then redeploy to the Masan sector when North Korean attacks threatened to break through there, and then redeploy again as the perimeter's crisis points shifted with the North Korean offensives developing momentum. The Marines who fought this mobile defense described the experience in terms that captured the specific exhaustion of fighting multiple intense engagements in rapid succession, without the recovery time that conventional military planning specified between major combat operations. Captain John Stevens, commanding a Marine company that fought at both Obong-ni Ridge and the subsequent Masan engagement, described the specific psychological toll of the mobile reserve role. You'd fight a battle, lose men, take the objective, and then before you'd had time to process what had just happened, you were back on trucks moving to the next crisis, Stevens said. There was no time to grieve, no time to recover, no time to do anything except keep moving and keep fighting because the next sector needed you as badly as the last one had. The strategic significance of the Pusan Perimeter's survival extended beyond the immediate tactical situation in Korea. The time that the perimeter's defense bought, the 6 weeks between the establishment of the perimeter in early August and the Inchon landing in mid-September 1950, was the time that General MacArthur needed to assemble and execute the amphibious operation at Inchon that would change the entire strategic calculation of the war. Inchon could not have happened without Pusan. The 150,000 North Korean soldiers who were committed to the assault on the Pusan perimeter were the same forces that Inchon, by landing behind their lines and cutting their supply routes, would trap and destroy. If Pusan had fallen before Inchon could be executed, there would have been no North Korean army positioned for Inchon to trap, no supply lines to cut, no strategic opportunity to exploit. The defenders of the Pusan perimeter did not know, in August and September 1950, that they were buying the specific time that a dramatic strategic reversal would require. They knew only that they had nowhere to retreat and that holding was the only available option. They held. By mid-September 1950, when the Inchon landing transformed the strategic situation, the North Korean forces attacking the Pusan perimeter had suffered casualties that their logistics and replacement systems could not sustain. The repeated attacks across the Naktong and against the perimeter's other approaches had cost the North Korean People's Army its experienced combat veterans and had reduced its combat effectiveness to a level from which the subsequent Inchon-triggered collapse became possible. The breakout from the Pusan perimeter that followed Inchon was conducted by forces that had spent 6 weeks fighting for survival, transitioning within days to an offensive operation that would eventually push North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel and, briefly, toward the Yalu River before the Chinese intervention changed the war's character entirely. The men who had held the Pusan perimeter through August and September 1950 received less historical recognition than the dramatic reversal of Inchon, which captured the public imagination in ways that a desperate defensive stand along a river in southeastern Korea did not. But the defense of Pusan was the precondition for everything that followed. Without it, there would have been no Korea for Inchon to liberate, no North Korean army to trap, no strategic situation for MacArthur's amphibious genius to exploit. The soldiers and Marines who held the line at the Naktong River, who fought the mobile defense at Obong-ni Ridge and Masan, who endured the August heat and the contaminated water and the nightly North Korean assaults with nowhere to retreat to, did what soldiers in desperate circumstances have always been asked to do. They held because there was nowhere else to go and because holding was the only thing that gave the country they were defending any chance of continuing to exist. They held. South Korea survived. Inchon happened because Pusan had held long enough for it to happen. That is the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter. That is what the men who fought it with their backs to the sea accomplished in the desperate August and September of 1950, before anyone knew that Inchon was coming or that the war would turn as dramatically as it eventually did. They did not know what was coming. They knew only that they had nowhere to retreat. They held anyway.